I'm gonna be honest, I've been feeling kind of creatively burnt out lately. I'm a big perfectionist, and I just haven't really been happy with anything I've made since like MODOK maybe? I've also been focusing a lot on the numbers lately, which is just never good for creativity in general. All that to say, I've been in a bit of a funk lately. And what's the best way to get out of a creative funk? Making something stupid for no reason. Picture this, Spider-Man and Electro are fighting each other. It's a vicious battle. Electro shoots a lightning bolt at Spider-Man, but it bounces off, it does nothing to him. That's when the camera pans down to reveal that Spider-Man is wearing Crocs. It's like the rubber shoes so the lightning doesn't do anything. You knew what you signed up for. And I thought it'd be really cool to make this in the style of classic Saturday morning cartoons like the original Spider-Man was.
It's a rhinoceros.
That one clip is better than the entirety of Kraven the Hunter. I've always been fascinated with why old things look the way they do and if you can recreate that look today. That's why I made a whole VHS tutorial. I remember there's this one episode from Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated where the whole idea was the episode was supposed to look like it was a classic Scooby-Doo cartoon, but like you could clearly tell that it wasn't, you know, like you can tell that it's just a modern cartoon just without the shading and a filter slapped on it. And you know, by modern cartoon, I mean one that's 15 years old now. Let that sink in. But why is this? What is it that actually makes an old cartoon look old, and how can you recreate this today? I found two things that really help nail that classic cartoon look. One of them's an animation trick, and the other one's a compositing trick. On the animation side, Saturday morning cartoons like the original Spider-Man were made on a shoestring budget. Two things that haven't changed since the 60s, animation is time consuming and animation is expensive. So they were trying to get away with using as few frames as possible. A lot of times, instead of animating the whole character every frame, they would just animate the part that needed to move as its own thing. So that's something I really wanted to keep in mind for my animation. So for example, I knew for the first shot I wanted Electro to shoot a bolt of lightning at Spider-Man, but instead of animating his full body leaning into it and shooting it in a really dynamic pose, instead I just had the body as one frame and then animated the arm as something separate. Now speaking of animation, I do have a bit of a confession to make. I can't really draw. I know, I wish I could. It's something I'm trying to get better at, but it just doesn't come naturally to me. So that raises the obvious question, how do you make a hand-drawn cartoon if you can't draw? I mean, the obvious answer is you don't, but that's no fun, so I didn't do that. Now, I don't have much experience drawing, but I do have experience in 3D. So what I did is I took some characters from Mixamo and then very roughly edited them so they looked like Electro and Spider-Man. Then I animated those and then drew over them using Blender's grease pencil tool. I should have said I used Blender in the first place. I use Blender for all that. Now this feels like cheating, but it's actually a really old animation technique called rotoscoping. I know nowadays rotoscoping usually refers to cutting out your subject from a background using masks, but back in the day it just referred to tracing over live action footage with your animation to give it a more realistic motion. It was used in a lot of old cartoons, even Disney used it. It feels kinda janky the way I'm using it, but at the end of the day, whatever technique helps you get the look you're going for is the right technique for you, especially if you're just making stuff for fun on your own. Now, even though I was using 3D animation, I kept those ideas of limited animation in mind and treated them like I was animating them in 2D. I only really cared if they looked good through the camera's point of view, so I really pushed the rigs in some shots, which might have led to me making objectively the coolest picture of all time. It's okay, you can screenshot it. Now I had the animation done, but that's only half the battle. And here's where that second trick to recreating the look of old cartoons comes in. Way back in the day, before computers were a thing, frames of animation were actually hand painted onto sheets of cellulose, which is why it's called cell animation. Each thing that had to move was on its own sheet of cell, and those cells were stacked on top of each other. That's the reason why in old cartoons, if something had to move from the background, it very clearly stood out. One of the effects that this gave is that a lot of times you'd see a little slight shadow beneath things that had to move on their own, and you could recreate this look using compositing. So here's my finished node tree in Fusion. It starts over here with the original body, just as one frame. Then over here, we've got the arm animation. So what I've done is I've added a little bit of a drop shadow to that around the edges, and I've keyframed that so it doesn't start until he starts moving. Another thing I've done to add another bit of separation to it is I've added a brightness contrast and just boosted the gain a little tiny bit so it's slightly brighter from everything else. And again, I've keyframed that so it doesn't start until he starts moving. That's another thing you see in old cartoons. A lot of times if something moves on its own, it'll be slightly discolored from the rest of it. Then I've merged that on top of my body, sort of pops in. Then over here, I've added my lightning effect. And again, I just drew that frame by frame in Blender. Then here, if I go to the beginning, I drew some mouth shapes, just a couple from open to close, really not a ton, and I animated these using the same technique from my mouth animation tutorial, which I'll probably link over here somewhere. So I've just got a time speed node, and the delay is connected to a control node over here. I've just keyframed to open, matching the audio. And then once again, added a bit of a drop shadow to that, and merged that over my character. Then I added a drop shadow over everything. It's a little bit subtle and it's hard to see over this checkered background. It'll be easier to see once we add the actual background. And speaking of that, what I did is I took a background, made it the color that I wanted, and then I added a paper overlay over that. So you can get that under Effects, Templates, Edit, and Generators, and you've got that paper generator there. And then I merged that over and gave it a multiply apply mode. This just gives it a little bit more texture than if I just used the straight background, but it also darkened it a little bit, so I added a brightness contrast just to combat that a little bit. So now we've got some nice texture there. And then I merged my character over that. And there you can see the drop shadow a bit more. It's still subtle, but it's subconsciously something that you notice. So then what I did is I added a transform node and just zoomed in on it. Because a lot of old cartoons use very limited animation, one thing they would do to add more movement is by adding camera movements like that. So I added that to my animation. So then here what I've done is I've added a blur node, but instead of having the blend at 100, I brought it down, so it gives it a bit of a hazy older look. Again, it's really subtle. You're not supposed to notice any of these things at once, but it's supposed to be more subtle things in the background. So then what I did is I took a black background and merged that over it with a rectangle mask just to give it that 4:3 aspect ratio. So another thing you'll see in old cartoons and just old media in general is a lot of film grain and film dirt on the lens. So what I did to replicate that is I downloaded this Super 8 overlay from pixabay.com. By default it's a really low resolution because I downloaded the free version, so I just added a resize node to that. Then it's got a slight reddish hue. It's really subtle, but I added a brightness contrast just to desaturate that. See before, after. Then what I did is I merged it over my footage with a multiply apply mode. But I didn't just want black dirt on the lens, I also wanted some white splotches. So what I did is from this brightness contrast, I added a time speed and set it to negative speed. So that way I'm getting a different pattern from the black splotches. So then what I did is I inverted that color. So instead of black and white, it's white and black. See there? But it's also adding a bit of gray here. So I added a brightness contrast and just crunched those down. And then I merged that over with a screen apply mode. And again, all these are really subtle, but they all work together to make it look more authentic.
Gotta say, this was pretty fun to make. I think it definitely helped me get out of my creative funk a bit. Sometimes you just gotta make something not for the algorithm. And consider this a challenge. That random dumb idea that's been in the back of your mind, go ahead and make it. The best idea in the world doesn't do you any good until you make something out of it. And after all that, you can see the final video right here.